I'm James Atkinson, and this is Drinks Adventures, the podcast where I speak to some of the world's most exciting producers of beer, wine and spirits and explore trends and issues in the drinks industry today. Today on the Drinks Adventures podcast, we're joined by a true pioneer of Australian whiskey, David Baker of Bakery Hill Distillery in Victoria. Founded in 1999, Bakery Hill was the first whiskey distillery on the mainland and the third to open in the modern era after the celebrated Tasmanian distilleries Lark and Sullivans Cove. Bakery Hill might be lesser known today than those brands, but that's certainly not down to the quality of its whiskies, which have received consistent acclaim from critics across the globe. I visited David for a chat about their journey to date and to hear some exciting news about their expansion plans coinciding with their 20th birthday this year. You can listen in right after this message from another one of our valued sponsors. Well, David Baker, thank you so much for joining me on the Drinks Adventures podcast.
My pleasure, James. It's great to see you at the distillery, and we should have a few quiet ones before the day's out.
Sounds good to me. Your distillery has a tremendous reputation among, whiskey enthusiasts, people in the industry, but you're not so well known outside of that. Why do you think that is?
The main reason for it is that Bakery Hill is 100% family owned. My sons are involved. As a result of that, we don't have huge amounts of money for capital, for massive growth, and we've actually focused our production at quality rather than quantity. We can't compete with the overseas distillers with prices, but where I can compete is quality. And from day one, and that was 20 years ago now, from day one, if there was any decisions to be made in production, the question was, will this improve the quality or not? And it had to be a yes, because people are prepared to pay a little more for whiskey if it's really, really good quality. So we aimed at providing a quality product.
You've mentioned to me that this will be the 20th anniversary of Bakery Hill. What inspired you to launch a distillery in the first place?
I'm a typical guy, and basically if I'm told I can't do something, I'll dig my toes in and say, yes, I can, and I'll show you I can. And I started to get an interest in whiskies when I constantly was bombarded with overseas paper articles saying the only place in the world that can make whiskey is overseas. And I said, no, that can't be right. We make fantastic wines in Australia. We make fantastic beers. It's a process. If you understand the process and you can modify it for local conditions, things should be possible. So I dug my toes in and I said, okay, I reckon we can make whiskey in Australia. So it was a long, long voyage. First of all, trying to get the bump out of processing, because we've all heard it's the air, it's the water, and the fairies at the bottom of the garden that make the difference. I can tell you now it ain't. It's the process. And if you understand the process and you can modify it, you can do wonders. My background was chemistry, and I took this as a chemical exercise. This is the raw materials. This is the end product that I want. How do we create footsteps to get there? And it took quite a while to actually break down the air, the water, and the fairies at the bottom of the garden into a chemical process. And we've done that. Now we're very, very happy with our product. As I said, we're a small family business, so we can't advertise, we can't market, because we just don't have supplies to provide volume sales. So we've kept ourselves a little bit under the radar, basically to handpick the outlets that are selling our product.
What was the reaction that you got from people back in the late 90s when you said, I'm going to start what was then the very first whiskey distillery on the mainland at the time?
People laughed and said, you're a bloody idiot, you're going to waste your money, I wouldn't even bother. And for about the first 5 or 6 years, we were being laughed at, of just being bloody idiots, and it can't be done in Australia.
How did that make you feel?
It made me more focused on being able to produce a good quality whiskey, because I knew that it was a process, and that as a chemist, I could look at all the reactions that were going on and I could come up with something that was equally good, at least.
And there were no decent textbooks to draw from, really, that did explain that process to you. It was more about you decoding that yourself.
No, there was very, very little. Unfortunately, most advertising, most marketing, most books that were written by individual distilleries. And all they were trying to do was prove that their product was the best. They didn't look at the product across the board. So basically, I had to forget everything that I ever read or had heard and start at square one. And then move forward in small steps, ensuring that each step was firm before we moved to the next step.
And I was a bit surprised to find out that you actually weren't a tremendous whiskey enthusiast prior to that point yourself.
In fact, I'd never had a whiskey. I've made up for it in the meantime, I can assure you. When I decided that, hey, whiskey could be something that we need to look at, I bought every bottle of whiskey I could lay my hands on. I looked at every review that I could lay my hands on and every whiskey production book, and had a very, very steep learning curve.
When you set out, what type of whiskey were you looking to create? Was there a blueprint internationally, or were you trying to create something new?
It had to be an Australian whiskey. I wasn't in the market to be producing a Scotch whiskey, similar to Scotch whiskies, but while I was learning as much as I could about whiskies, I discovered that there were whiskey regions in Scotland, the Highlands, the Lowlands, the Islands and Speyside. And I was absolutely besotted by the whiskies that were coming out of the Speyside region. I loved the character, I loved the aromas and I loved the flavours. So that was a marker that I was actually aiming towards, to have a whiskey which had the residual sugars. It had the flavour, the aroma of a Speyside whiskey. That we've been able to do basically because of the design of the still that was made in the UK. I spoke to the still engineers of the company, and they said, look, before we can design a still for you, you need to tell us exactly the style of whiskey that you would like to produce. Because every dimension in this still, every angle, is going to affect the quality and the characteristic. So I went through a long discussion of the styles of whiskies that I enjoyed. When they got to a point that they then understood that, they then sat back and drew and designed stills for us. Now, what is the important characteristic of the stills? I don't know. Height is an important one that I do know. The taller the still, the more aromatic flavours, the more aromas you're going to get through the whiskies. Boiling bulge on the top of the still is important. What that does is it provides depth and character, a three-dimensional structure. But apart from that, that's the job of the still engineer. My job is to put the stuff in a bottle, is to make it, put it in a bottle and enjoy it.
And what about the oak regime? Did you have a definite idea of what you wanted to do there?
At that stage, and this was very, very early in whiskey's production in Australia, I knew what I wanted, and more particularly, I knew what I didn't want. What is quite common in whiskey distillation is to use French oak barrels that have contained other products, sherry, port, Madeira, wines. What that does is basically blankets the whiskey with sherry, port or Madeira characteristics. That I didn't want to do. So the barrels that we use are American oak, bourbon casks we get from Jack Daniels. They're heavily charred, which means that the spirit is not going to soak into the wood to any great degree. And also, what was in the barrel previously is not going to soak in. So our whiskies are not being tainted with other products, sherry, port or Madeira. What you get in a Bakery Hill is our whiskey and the flavours that we wish to impart into the whiskey.
You've also mentioned to me that you were not keen to release any of your whiskies until they were sufficiently matured. Was that a bit of trial and error early on, working out, how long it was for your whiskies to peak in this environment?
That's an interesting discussion because, yes, you're right. Basically, I was producing new make spirit, putting it in the barrels, maturing, and tasting the whiskey and saying, no, it's not quite right yet, it's not quite right. And I had a phone call from the guy who ran the Australian whiskey, one of the Australian whiskey clubs, and he was putting on a whiskey show in Canberra. And this was when our whiskies were 3 years old. And he said, why don't you release your whiskies in Canberra, let the public have a look at it and see how you go. So I thought, what the hell, we'll do that. So up to Canberra I went with our whiskies that were 3 years old. And people enjoyed them. And I was surprised. It was 3 years old, so we thought, okay, let's leave it for another year just to improve it a little bit more. So we left it for 4. We started selling when they were 4 years old, but I left one for 5 years and it improved so much better. We made it 5 years. Then we made it 6, then we made it 7. So now we bottle when the whiskey has reached the standard that we're really, really happy with, regardless of the age. Typically, we're bottling now at 6 or 7 or 8 years, depending on the activity of the wood. It's worth it for us to hold back and to provide whiskey of that 6, 7 or 8 years because the quality is so much better.
With such a long maturation time relative to some of the other distilleries, this recent boom in interest in craft spirits, it takes a while to react to that and sort of meet the market. So is that one of the reasons why, you talk about we don't want to advertise because we sell through all our product anyway?
This is exactly the problem. What we're selling currently, we produced 6, 7 years ago. 6 or 7 years ago, we never understood the demand that was going to be provided. Unfortunately, that's what we're selling. We only sell the whiskies that we put a big tick on.
In recent years, have you sort of ramped up production to try and meet that demand?
Absolutely. We increased production about 5, 6 years ago. We're still waiting for that to come on stream. Probably come on stream about December, January of the end of this year. So yes, we will have more product to sell. The other thing which has been a major problem for us is we're exporting to France, Germany and Sweden. They loved our whiskies. The problem is the local demand, and I mean Victoria, a little bit in Sydney, South Australia, has just taken over and we can't export anymore because the local demand is so intense.
So there's a big opportunity there for you if you want to take it.
Certainly is. Obviously, we increased production, as I mentioned, not to a huge amount, but we should be able to get back into a small export market. But Australia is such a huge continent, and the numbers of people now drinking whiskey is huge. I'm not sure whether we will be able to export, but we'll see.
You're still sticking to the single cask production model? There's no plans to deviate from that?
No. What a lot of distilleries do is they have a collection of casks, maybe half a dozen casks. They put them all together and they bottle them. It means that their bottling regimes, their bottling runs is much larger. But what that does is it provides an average. And unfortunately, the average is less than the best. Now, what we do is we number each cask, as we have to do. And we have records for each cask. Every couple of years, we'll then go and we'll look at the casks and see how they're developing. We get the staff here together and we find perhaps half a dozen casks that we think may be getting close to development, to maturation, and we'll then try them. And we'll only select the cask or casks that we think are perfect. Because each cask may mature at a different rate. We can pick the casks that are exactly that we want our branding on.
Tell me about some of the more recent introductions to the range. We talked about your experiments with peated malt.
We have our standard range, our classic, our double wood, and our peated. But we also like playing around. Occasionally we'll get some interesting phone calls, and a couple of interesting phone calls happened 8 years ago. And that was from a maltings in Belgium. And they said, we've got this fantastic peated malt you might be really, really interested in. It's 50 parts per million, which is, for us, a heavy peat. And I thought, let's give it a go, see how it goes. So we bought half a dozen pallets, we distilled it, we put it in barrels, and we left it. And my son, who's now in the business and has been so for 3-4 years, he said, it's about time we had a look at those barrels. They've been there a while. We pulled the bungs out. They were fantastic. So what we've done there is we've used a different style of malt with different peating. It's a island peat as opposed to a highland peat. It's a heavy peat, 50 parts, as opposed to our normal peat, which is about 20, 23. So that's one way that we can change things slightly. Another way is that we sent some barrels to a brewery, Hop Nation, about 12 months ago, because they wanted to see how their beers would develop in whisky casks. So we said goodbye to half a dozen of our barrels, and then had the phone call that the beers were ready. Would you like to go down and try them? And they were fantastic. So what they've done is they've now decanted, tipped the beer out, and we've got a couple of those back again, and we've put matured whisky into the Hop Nation barrels that was originally here for our whiskies. So we're going to see what the whisky is going to finish like after it's been in a beer barrel.
So lots more experimentation.
Oh, lots more. We've had wineries, a very special winery that was producing beautiful, beautiful muskets. And they said, would you like a musket barrel? And we said, thank you, we'll do that. So we've got another barrel out the back that's had musket, and we're finishing our whiskies in a musket barrel just to see how they're going. These are very, very small projects, but they're done basically just to see the difference that the barrels are going to make, and they're good fun.
Who were the consumers of Bakery Hill in the early days?
Answering this question focuses back on me, because I thought that the local market was the older gentleman, liked to buy a bottle, go home, sit at home, enjoy it. How wrong I was. The market for single malt whiskies, 85% of our sales are the 18 to 40-year-olds. It is the young people. They are really, really wanting to learn about whisky. They are enjoying good quality product, and they are seeking it out. The older gentlemen, which I was looking at originally, tend to be very brand loyal, and also the market is the younger people. We're finding now that nearly 50% of our sales are going to women. So what I was thinking of is completely wrong. It's the young people, males and females.
When you started getting some accolades, global accolades from the likes of Jim Murray in the 2000s,
Yep.
Did that really bring a lot of attention to Bakery Hill?
Look, it did. The problem was then that we didn't have the young market. Well, Jim Murray gave us best small distillery whisky of the year, of Jim Murray's, all the whiskies he'd gone through. That was a number of years ago. And it was the older people that were around at that stage. The younger people really hadn't come on board. So yes, we got accolades and we did well, and we sold some. But comparing the market now with what it was like 6-7 years ago, if we did it again, we'd be just overrun.
Tell me about the new site.
The new site, yes, we can.
We can go on the record about that?
Yes, we can. I've been looking for a new site for many, many, many years. Basically, I moved in here because I just needed a place to store all our equipment and to prove we could make whisky. Now, we've been so busy making and selling over the last couple of years that any thought of relocating really was the last thing I was thinking of. But then I thought, no, it's time to really move to a place that we can be proud of, a place that we're very, very happy to bring people in and is very special. We were approached about 2 years ago by a company that was restoring a wool mills in Kensington. And this is about 200 metres from the Kensington station. The wool mills was originally built in the late 1800s, early 1900s, and was used for wool clarifying or scarifying for many, many, many years. It's now been purchased and it's going to be used for specialist producers, beer, cheese, whiskey, and we were asked if we'd like to take over an area there. Well, we're taking over about 500 square metres. We should be moving in late December, early January this year. One of the things that was important was that they've restored the building back to the way it was when it was originally built. So it's an absolutely special place for our stills, a place we can be proud of and a place we can be extremely happy to bring people in and to show them our range of whiskies and to educate them. We've got 2 areas, 250 square metres, so 500 square metres in total. One area will be our production area. It'll also be barrel storage, because it's one thing to make whiskey and to put it in barrels, but it has to be stored over long periods of time. So we'll be using one area to do that. The other area, which is adjacent, that will be marketing, distribution and sales. We won't have a large walk-in, walk-out bar as such. It'll be more of a small tasting area. There'll be an area in there where we do education, where people can come in, they sit down, and we can talk to them about whiskey production, flavours, how we do it, why our whiskies are the way they are. Education will be an important part of this new area.
So Bakery Hill's coming out of the shadows.
It is coming out of the shadows, yes, absolutely. So two stops from the Melbourne Central.
And what does the future hold for the distillery other than that? Your son's actively involved in the business. Is he keen to carry on the story? Absolutely so. When my son came on board about 3-4 years ago, he brought in with him, being a younger person, the facilities of being able to use Facebook, use Twitter, use all the media that's available, which I, at that stage, really didn't use. So he's brought all that on board. He also looks after our sales, marketing and distribution, which is fantastic because our market are the 18 to 40-year-olds. And they're interested in electronic media, they're interested in podcasts, all these things. Fantastic. Well, David, I look forward to visiting you at the new distillery next time, and congratulations on 20 years.
It's been an interesting time. Who'd have thunk it, eh? 20 years. It's time flies when you're having fun. The market is absolutely exciting at the moment. It's a great industry to be in, and the other distillers are great people to know. They're fabulous. It's a real network.
Well, thanks for joining me on the podcast.
It's my pleasure. Thank you very much, James. Thoroughly enjoyed it.
The Drinks Adventures podcast is produced by me, James Atkinson, with additional production and mixing by Dave Robertson. You can find complete transcripts, links and other information on the show at drinksadventures.com.au. You can follow me on all social media platforms at @ByJamesAtkinson, like my Facebook page, James Atkinson Drinks Adventures, to be kept informed of podcast giveaways and other news about the show. The Drinks Adventures podcast needs your support as listeners. Please do us a favour and leave an honest review and rating for the podcast on iTunes or Stitcher. We love hearing your feedback and it helps inform other people this is a show worth listening to. Or simply drop us a line at hello@drinksadventures.com.au.